So this time we're keeping the presentation just to really one topic, which is the proposed provisions to the Network Information Systems Regulations, the NIS Directive, that the UK is making. Now, separately, the European Union is currently consulting on changing the directive on which these regulations are based. But now that we are leaving the EU, DCMS actually has the ability to change what's being the NIS regulations, should it so wish, and has decided that it will adjust these regulations, really mostly so as to step up the enforcement regime and to lower the thresholds, both of which actually are things that could be done within the context of the existing NIS directive. So it's not actually a derogation away from the way that the European Union is approaching this, although that would now be open to them. So they announced these plans in August. They did a public consultation. That public consultation has now closed. We have heard from them that most of the feedback was broadly positive. We have not seen a public announcement made with the final text of what's going to happen. So we will wait to see what that comes. But the key changes to the that are being made, firstly, changes to qualifying essential services. So lowering the threshold for an IXP that falls within the NIS from 50% market share to 30% market share. Again, as I had previously commented in relation to the original version, actually what is meant here by market share, not very well defined, but that's the change. For those that are the other area of essential services within this, remember, network services are covered by the Communications Act security, so this is just not counting network services, but DNS resolvers and registries are within the scope of NIS. One change that's being made is to bring foreign entities that operate DNS resolvers for the UK or DNS registries for the UK will be within scope of the UK regulation, even if they're established abroad, if they pass the qualifying threshold based on the number of queries, or in the case of registries, the number of domains from the UK. So the registry threshold for it is being changed from 14 billion queries to 14 billion queries in 168 hours, that's a week, from 2 billion in 24 hours. So not actually a change in the overall rate, but stretched over a week. For authoritative DNS servers, the threshold for being covered by NIS is being moved to 100,000 domains hosted, brought down from 250,000 domains hosted. So potentially new actors being brought within the scope there. And for those operating resolvers, the change has been, the threshold has been brought down very substantially to anyone who does 500,000 queries in a week, as compared with 2 million in a day. So potentially many more operators of resolvers within scope. And that also includes those that are established abroad if you're getting those queries from IP addresses in the UK. So other changes are mostly in the area of information sharing, inspection and enforcement. So on the information sharing, they're extending the powers to share information that is gathered for the purpose of enforcing these regulations, not only the regulator, but to be shared with other regulators and other law enforcement authorities, and adding new grounds for them sharing. So not only for the purpose of the regulations, but also for the purposes of national security, and also for the prevention, detection, investigation, and prosecution of crime. the proposed changes also create a new post of inspector that can be appointed by the regulator to carry out inspections of regulated entities. Now, under the regulations as they stand at the moment, the regulator is able to demand information so that they can enforce the directive in the regulations. But this is the idea of an actual position that can be created and appointed to investigate a particular entity and exercise the regulator's powers on behalf of the regulator. But how that would work in practice would change, because as things stand, the regulator can write to a regulated entity and require them to provide information. This inspector would be able to go directly to the entity and demand to see things, inspect records, inspect config and inspect systems directly, take statements and conduct interviews with members of staff, and even conduct tests, technical tests themselves, or any other action relevant to the inspection.
Malcolm?
Yes?
We just have a question. Any idea who they intend to include by changing the thresholds, in particular for IXs from 50% to 30%? Does it change anything in practice?
I'm afraid I do not know that, actually, and they're not willing to discuss other named entities with me. So sorry about that. But if you think you might be affected by this, then you might have to ask them yourself for what their expectations are. It should be said that you are actually, or each entity that is included within the scope here, is under a duty, a legal duty, to notify Ofcom if you do indeed qualify.
And another quick question on the resolvers, 500K queries or IPs?
From my recollection, it's 500,000 IP addresses querying.
Okay.
But I actually want to go back and check that.
Yeah, the consensus seems to be that as well. So.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So where did I get to? Yes, I was talking about the inspector. Yes, so this inspector actually would in practice significantly extend how closely the regulator gets to deal with the company, rather than a very arm's length paper-based inspection. Can also a new change to order the regulated party to leave equipment or records or configuration undisturbed for the purposes of an inspection. So if they think that you might be in breach of the regulations, they can say, don't touch that, don't correct it, so that we can ensure, we can gather the information needed to show that you were in breach, which could of course potentially be an issue. And the inspector is able to give instructions to regulated parties for the purposes of inspection, and that's a general and very broadly stated power. On enforcement, there is one new area that is being enforced, which is the duty to appoint a person in the UK to act as a representative. So if you're established outside the UK and are covered by the scope of this, Ofcom can issue a notice and start enforcement action to require you to appoint a person in the UK as your representative. That's essentially a new enforceable area. All enforcement notices must be complied with, even if you've paid a penalty for non-compliance. So you will no longer have the right to say, okay, well, I'll pay your penalties, fine, but I'm not doing it. No, you pay the penalties and you do it. And there will be further enforcement action to make sure that happens. They've now split the enforcement penalty system. Rather than just issuing a penalty notice, now what will happen is they will issue a notice of an intended penalty. Apologies for the spelling mistake on the slide. And that will go to the regulated entity, and you will then be able to make representations about that back to the regulator, and then they will issue a final penalty notice. And finally, they've changed the tiers of the fines that are available somewhat, and I've put on the slide, I really given you a visual there to show what's happening there. So they've cut out the £3.5 million maximum fine tier completely. So you've still got the £1 million fines for breaches that aren't even material breaches at all. And then after that, it's straight into £8.5 million maximum fine for any kind of breach at all, that is provided it is material in some way. And then after that, the £17 million, that tier, the level is not being changed. That's still £17 million, but instead of requiring to reach that tier, it have to be a breach that causes a threat to life or having a significant impact on the UK. It has to be one that causes a significant impact on the service provision by the regulated party. So in general, therefore, the general tenor of that is that the levels of fines, maximum fines that are available, are being increased. Right, so then next is on appeals. There was an independent appeals process set out within the regulations as they stand at the moment. That's now being done away with and replaced with a much more standard appeals process, which is to appeal to the first tier tribunal of the General Regulatory Chamber, which is a body that does that is essentially a court-like tribunal, a standardized one that does a lot of regulatory enforcement action. As it stands, for example, the first tier tribunal also deals with handling enforcement cases in relation to GDPR. The first tier tribunal will only have the power to remit notices back to the regulator to be redone if you win your appeal. So if you appeal and the first tier tribunal finds in your favour, all they can do is say to the regulator, no, you haven't got this right. You've gone too far, or you misunderstood, or whatever it might be. You go back and redo what you've done. So if you're appealing on the grounds that something is disproportionate, for example, the first tier tribunal will say this is disproportionate, but they won't get to say what happens instead. It goes then back to Ofcom to decide what they will do instead that will be proportionate. And the regulator's decision at that point on how they comply with the first tier tribunal decision is said in the regulations to be final. So identifying some areas of potential issues that certainly LINX raised in written response to the consultation. Firstly, the potential size of the fines for smaller entities is, they're very heavy, potentially very heavy penalties there, and it's not ranged according to the size of the company and their ability to pay. Now, the regulator has a general duty in law when it levies a fine to act in a proportionate manner, but the fairness of these fines depends very heavily on the regulator having essentially a reasonable view of what is proportionate. And bearing in mind that we're talking about essential services that are being regulated precisely because they're considered essential to the UK, the regulator might well view that very stiff fines as being proportionate. Who knows? The next area is the non-reviewable nature of the regulator's compliance with the tribunal decisions. Now, this is an area of law that's quite complex, and I would need more detail, but certainly on the face of it, it seems that you could potentially appeal something to the tribunal on the grounds that it's disproportionate, win that argument, have it remitted back to Ofcom. Ofcom comes up with something entirely new that's not disproportionate in the manner that the tribunal objected to, but potentially disproportionate in an entirely different way. And then it seems that that would not be open to review, which seems wrong. Definitely, I mean, if there's anyone from the membership who's got experience of a similar regime to that, I'd be interested in hearing how that works, because that definitely sounds, potentially like something that could cause problems. And the last area of potential issues is the inspector's powers, which could be very onerous because they're very broadly stated. Indeed, the fact that it says that the air inspector can issue any direction for the purposes of ensuring compliance with the regulations could be taken as including a power to demand compliance, i.e. to correct things rather than merely carry out an inspection. That's clearly not intended by the mechanism that's done, but the whole way that these regulations are set out has the regulator issuing a notice to correct things, and the inspector's role is only to inspect. But nonetheless, those powers are written in a very loose way, and they might potentially extend a bit further. And certainly if there was some ambiguity about whether or not the effect of a demand was to support the inspection or to actually bring about corrective action, then it tends to veer in favour of the inspector being able to do what he wants, which is not really the intended structure of the regulations. And the last area with the inspector's powers that's potentially problematic is that instruction to leave things undisturbed so that we can come along and inspect it and find out if you were in breach. If they're ordering documents to be left undisturbed is one thing, but when that extends to operational systems and configuration, that does raise the possibility that a leave undisturbed order could prevent corrective action that is necessary in order to bring the system back into proper operation, i.e. to correct a fault. And that would be a real problem if that happened. So there are the areas of issues that I've identified. Are there any further questions on the NIS regulations in the chat channel, Jen?
No, there's a bit of chat, but no questions, just clarification. So
okay. Then, thank you. In that case, I'll just very quickly skip through the results of the member satisfaction survey in relation to public affairs. There was the question, how satisfied are you with the approach LINX takes to public affairs, which is the general overall satisfaction question. And that's pleasingly tipped up slightly compared with last year, although it's still down lower than the year before. How aware are you of the work of the LINX's public affairs team? Does seem to be on a downward trend, so we definitely have more work to do to raise awareness there. This was something that we actually identified in the drop last time around as an objective that we were really going to work to. I'm afraid COVID has really got in the way of doing the sort of outreach engagement that we might have otherwise hoped to do. The general questions are just to make sure that we're keeping it reasonably in the middle in terms of the selection and style of work here, the range of issues we take up as being about right, missing some issues or intervenes too often, again showing about right. Likewise, the question on analytical detail versus the bigger picture, again very strongly about right. And the lobbying style, whether it's too collaborative with government or too assertive and confrontational or about right, again, very strong levels for the about right. So happy with that. Finally, the last question was, are you satisfied that LINX is speaking to the right people in your organization? And again, what continually surprises me that there is such a high answer of yes there. We consistently get this result. I do wonder whether that's always entirely valid, but those are the written results that we get, so we share them with you.